Most important being that um, history happens, our development as a field has happened in a social context full of biases, full of assumptions. And there's kind of this narrative about science that it's objective. And the truth is that all of us have implicit bias and hidden biases. And by studying our history, we can see where we've gone wrong in the past and hopefully avoid some of those issues in the future. So this is going to seem a little bit of a strange arc, but I'm going to start by talking about the early origins of the inferential statistics and the connection to eugenics. And then I'm going to move on to somebody who got lost in history. So part of understanding our history is understanding that it was written by the dominant culture, and perhaps that's not an accurate portrayal of who did what and who really discovered certain things. And so we're going to talk about William DuBois, who has been argued to be the father of interactive data visualization in some corners. And then we're going to finish up by looking at some current issues in our current data collection, things that we've become aware of more recently, but perhaps weren't aware of 20 years ago. When my career started, we weren't thinking about things like presenting gender as binary and how that might marginalize some people. And the whole point of all of this will be, we'll kind of come to a set of conclusions related to that. And I really feel that the history of the field really should be taught to every student, and that everybody should be concerned about our history because it really is informative as to the mistakes we might be making in the present. So having started with that, that's the abstract. I'll leave that. All right, so why history? I think I've explained some of that. Science isn't objective. It occurs in a social context. What we choose to study is by itself a method of biasing the field, right? And then in statistics, we care a lot about assumptions. We care about the assumptions behind our models, the assumptions behind hypothesis testing. And we teach our students that if the assumptions are not met, then you can't trust the results of the test. Okay. So there are assumptions behind the techniques we use, but there's also assumptions behind data. We tend to think of data as coming to us as complete and whole and truth. And in fact, if you know anything about data collection processes, there's a lot of error and there are biases in what data we collect and how it's collected. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then societal biases influence both of these things, right? And so when we look at the type of biases that women encounter, that members of racial and ethnic minorities encounter, those biases in society get reflected in our data, reflected in our analysis, and lead to further marginalization of some groups in our society. So as statisticians, we have a responsibility to understand our own biases and try to fight that tendency of societal biases to kind of make their way into our data and our processes without any kind of edit or critical thought. All right, so I want to start with eugenics. I think it's a lot of people now understand that the beginnings of inferential statistics are deeply entwined with the eugenics movement. And in fact, the eugenics term was coined by Sir Francis Galton, who was the originator of the ideas behind linear regression. And what Francis Galton said was that eugenics is the basis of a scientific religion. I find this fascinating, which could lead to the utopian situation where problems such as alcoholism, criminality, disease, and poverty had disappeared. So I want you to notice that these are all noble aspirations, right? So just because somebody has noble intent doesn't mean that they're using noble methods to get to that hopeful conclusion. And then in the early 20th century, a different definition, a scientifically based ideal which could be used to guide policy and practice over a wide range of problems in health and welfare. So this doesn't say what it really is. And what it really is about is assuming that some people's genetics make them better as people than other people's genetics. And that's a very dangerous road to go down once you start, it's by whose measure are these genetics better than these genetics? And that measure is typically whatever the dominant culture says the measure is. And so that can be very dangerous. All right, I want to look specifically at Ronald Fisher. And part of the reason I want to look at him is because there was a lot of controversy behind the decision to retire the Fisher Lecture by COPS, by the Committee of the Presidents of Statistical Societies. But they did so because they felt that because of Fisher's involvement in eugenics, it wasn't an appropriate award and that it would be off-putting for some people. And the controversy was wide. And what happened was people either came onto the side of Fisher as an angel, wasn't prejudiced at all. How could you say this? To Fisher, the devil incarnate, and did all sorts of evil things. And of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So, to understand Fisher, we need to understand Fisher's origin story. And his origin story is kind of fascinating. He was a brilliant young man. When he was born, he was close to his mother, who shared his temperament. And as a neurodivergent person, I have to say that the story of R.A. Fisher and the way he was really sounds like he was neurodivergent. But I, of course, don't have the qualifications to declare that to be true. But this quote is from a biography written by his daughter. To outsiders, she, meaning Katie, his mother, seemed cold and insensitive, and it is quite possible that even a beloved child became aware of her love not through maternal warmth but indirectly. If this interpretation is correct, Katie passed on to her son her own inadequate emotional vocabulary. So those of us on the neurodivergent spectrum might be thinking, this all sounds very familiar. But that's not the start. It wasn't just what innately he was. He had some pretty significant life experiences as a child. His mother died when he was 14, which is a difficult age to lose a parent, especially a parent you're very close to. His father went broke 18 months later, which left him needing to finish his education by scholarship, which he found very humiliating. He matriculated to Caius College in 1910, and he found the eugenics movement during college. It had really just started up in earnest in Britain. And he helped to found the Cambridge, because this was part of Cambridge University, the Cambridge Eugenics Society. In that process, he discovered he really liked human beings, right? He really felt a need to be deeply connected to human beings. Like a lot of us on the neurodivergent scale, there's this assumption that because the way you interact with people is different, that maybe you don't find people as important. But he definitely did. Um, After he completed his master's degree, he was a bit lost. He believed in eugenics, this idea. He thought he was supposed to be an ideal eugenic specimen, somebody with ideal genetics. I mean, after all, he rose out of these difficult situations. But it turned out he didn't qualify for the army because of his eyesight, which was a big blow to him. He ended up taking teaching jobs so that the teachers could go off and fight in the war. He was terrible, had terrible, experiences trying to teach, prepubescent boys. Um, and he was basically living and breathing eugenics, and his salvation came through the eugenics movement. The Eugenics Education Society was formed in 1907. He actually was given a job 1 day a week. He would go in and do a lot of the research. He did a lot of reviews of books, that sort of thing. But basically, the Eugenics Society kept him intellectually afloat and became his second family. And when he got married, he married another person who believed strongly in eugenics and basically lived the eugenics ideal, which was that the intellectual middle class should be having lots of children because they had great genes, and the lower class should be having as few children as possible because their genes were somewhat more suspect. And if you look at the pictures, he had, a whole parcel of children under this belief. So one of the myths about Fisher is that he stopped being interested in eugenics or stopped being participating in the eugenics movement when he went to Rothamsted. And that's been written in papers, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The evidence for how he was involved in eugenics isn't in his academic papers, it's in his continued contributions to the Eugenics Society. So he was actually became one of the honorary secretaries after he was no longer employed. Later on, he became a vice president. He inherited the editorship of Eugenics Review when he took the Galton professor position at the University of London. And as late as 1935, he was giving the annual speech at the big eugenics dinner. And so his involvement in eugenics lasted and affected his work. I mean, part of why some of these techniques were created, like linear regression, like hypothesis testing, was to show how some human beings were different than other human beings. So, all of this is kind of par for the course for the scientific elite of the time. Where Fisher's kind of internal clock and mores kind of led him to stick to eugenics when everybody else left it behind was what happened after World War II. And so when World War II occurred and the Nazis were using eugenics ideals to argue their case, a lot of scientists said, wait a second, this is not what we meant at all. We're going to step way back from the eugenics idea and realize the folly. Fisher was never able to change his mind about it, and part of that might just be his internal mentality, and I think part of it was his deep emotional connection to the eugenics movement, right? This was his second family, after he went to college. But anyway, after World War II, there was an initiative by the United Nations Economic and Social Council to consider the desirability of initiating and recommending the general adoption of a program of disseminating scientific facts designed to remove what is generally known as racial prejudice. And the key of this was, are people of different races genetically superior or inferior? Now, Fisher was one of only 4 people that objected, and he was the only one that came out and said, "People of different racial groups have different intelligence and abilities." And like I said, this was way after everybody else kind of figured out this was not a politically suave thing to believe, or honestly realized the folly of their ways and changed their beliefs. Um, as late as a few years before his death, I was able to find evidence from his correspondence that he still believes strongly in eugenics. That does make Fisher different than everybody else in his generation. It's, that generation of scientists, and that he didn't ever step back from these ideals. So, who was this guy? Well, I think he was unaware of his emotional and social implications of his words and actions. I think this may have stemmed from the way his childhood worked out. I'm wondering if maybe he fell on the autistic spectrum. I know I have Asperger's here, which is no longer a cool or a title used. But again, with a caveat, I am not a professional. I can't make that decision. It just, the stories sound very familiar to me. He kind of had an underdog complex. He was really, once he had an idea, he wouldn't let go of it. And I don't know if that was because to let go of it was to admit he was wrong, or he just had that kind of rigidity of thinking. But he had some incredible feuds, which, if you know anything about Fisher, he has some famous academic feuds. And I don't think he was ever aware of how his own emotions influenced his scientific thinking. Um, that kind of inability to understand the connection between his emotions and what he believed scientifically led him to continue to believe in eugenics, led to his position on smoking and cancer. He was one of the people that argued that smoking did not cause cancer. He was a smoker. Um, and I think because eugenics was so entwined with his beliefs about the way the world was put together, he just couldn't let that go. And so he was a genius, undoubtedly, invented likelihood, experimental design. He was also a flawed human being. He was emotionally unaware. He was temperamental, had quite the temper. He was vicious to his perceived enemies. Again, those feuds are famous. Eugenics was a way of life to him, primarily as it related to social classes. The original eugenics ideals had to do with the idea that people of lower social classes had less intelligence, that it was kind of, social class was a proxy for intelligence level, and only secondarily as it related to racial differences. And I think if someone like Fisher can trick himself into false scientific arguments, any of us can. And so I actually am writing this up, this talk up. And what I have to say about this is, to honor Fisher, we need to acknowledge both his contributions and the harm he caused at the same time in the same memorial or discussion. We need to accept and validate the experiences of those that have been harmed by his flaw arguments, rather than defend him using techniques regarding the definition of racism, or use single case attempts to disprove the large body of evidence that elucidates his racial biases. So some people have argued, oh, well, he had a Black student. Yes, he did. He was able to see individuals as individuals. That didn't change his underlying beliefs. Finally, we need to take example of Fisher and apply it to ourselves in our own work. Only by truly respecting and considering the critiques, opinions, and feelings of the others around us can we hope to understand how our own assumptions can bias our scientific findings and impede our search for scientific truths. And so, yeah, I did start working on this in 2023. I'll be happy to publish it hopefully in 2025, but there you have it. So that's piece one. I now want to turn to piece two, which relates because it's about the accomplishments of an African American man. And Sarah, I'm going to ask you to let me know kind of when I'm at 10 minutes and 5 minutes and that sort of thing. Feel free to just interrupt because I can't see my clock here. So.
Can do.
All right, thank you. All right, so who was William DuBois? You probably heard the name. He was really famous. He was born in 1868, didn't die until 1963. I hope I get to live as long as DuBois did. He was, quoting, a scholar, writer, editor, and civil rights pioneer. But note that what's missing is anything related to data visualization, which is the role we're going to talk about today, his contributions to data visualization. And we're going to talk about why they may have gone ignored. He actually got all three of these degrees from Harvard. He was the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University in 1895. His Harvard doctoral thesis was the suppression of the African slave trade to the United States of America between 1638 and 1870, and it became the first volume of the Harvard Historical Studies series. He was actually a co-founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He helped create the field of sociology. He had amazing accomplishments. But he also did some pretty amazing things in data visualization, and that's what we're going to focus on. And it's all around the Paris World's Fair, the Paris Exposition in 1900. So if you look at this picture, this is a picture that this is a picture of a room that was front and center in the sociology building during the Paris Exposition. And it was quite an accomplishment that, apparently in previous expositions, if there was anything about the African-American experience, it was considered a separate topic. But this was dead center in the United States display area. And he developed this amazing portrait of the lives of African-Americans for this building. And his thesis, basically, there was a lot of argument that African-Americans couldn't be prosperous on their own, that they didn't have the ability to pull the rise the way that Caucasians or other races did. And this presentation really was an incredible refutal of that assumption. And his big goal was to show how African Americans had thrived despite the biases in society towards the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. As part of this exposition, there were 56 charts representing multiple innovative presentations of data. And so he was actually one of the first people to say, let's tell a sociological data story. Let's tell a story through these charts. He basically linked them into this kind of presentation that kind of told the story of the African-American experience in the United States at the time. He won a gold award for it. He won one of the top awards, a lot of awards for this presentation. It was amazing. But the work went, I won't say it was completely ignored. There were some people who really liked it. It was represented at the Pan American Exposition, I believe in 1901. There were some universities that were very interested in it. But if you look at, the history of data visualization, until very recently, his name was not included. And so basically, presumably because he was an African-American scholar, because the topic was so controversial and against the societal norm, his work kind of got ignored. So basically, why we care about this is this guy was really ahead of his time. And so this is a quote from a book called DuBois' Data Portrait, Visualizing Black America. It has every single one of those 56 presentations are there, printed in there. But it's a small book. You don't get to see it kind of blown up, but you kind of get to see what he did. And the colors, shapes, typography of the charts foreshadow critical developments in the history of data visualization, including simplified pictographic form, isotype picture language, minimal typographical palettes used by the international, and I apologize for the typo there, typographic style, not stipple. Sorry about that. And also, if you know anything about the history of data visualization, Edward Tufte is one of the really big names there. He produced a set of books. In fact, I think some of them are on my, they're on my wall back there, about data visualization. And the idea of visual narrative that Tufte kind of explained and researched was there in the work of DuBois in 1900. He was aware of Playfair's bar charts and line graphs and Nightingale's use of data visualization to prompt social action. I mean, he was a very educated man, but the way he presented the data was unique at the time. All right. So there's a man named Jason Forrest who has argued, a currently alive person in the data visualization world, who has argued that DuBois could be considered the inventor of the idea of interactive data visualization, or perhaps the most well-known example, the earliest example, at least we found thus far. And this is an example, what Jason was able to get the Library of Congress to let him look at the originals close up, specifically this original close up of one of these plates that were created for the 1900 World's Fair. And the quote I have here is, in fact, this work. So this was the very first panel. And he says this work is not just the key to the entire series, it is also the first chart in exhibition audiences would have interacted with, as it was the first chart on a stack of works that people would go back and forth and interact with. And let's talk about that. Okay, so
you have 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Okay, so this is actually from Jason Forrest's work, a picture of the original World's Fair. And if you do the little breakout, this panel that you just saw was the very first panel on the top on a stack that was right at the level where people were invited. They didn't just interact with it, to look back and forth, to understand what was going on. And this is just what was at the bottom of there for further statistics. Raise this frame. And so people were encouraged to go and play through it. And basically this was equivalent to a double click, right? He was encouraging people to go back and forth. There were two big pieces to this. There was a deep look at Georgia and then an overall exposition over the entire United States. And so this is the link if you want to go see Jason Forrest's work itself. But Jason points out that you can see the scratches, the fingernails, the way people were interacting with the data at the time, and like looking at different like viewpoints and pictures. So it's not as fancy as what we do with interactive data visualization now, but the idea that you're going to flip back and forth between different views of the same data is an interactive data visualization idea. And so I'm going to be looking for more definitive evidence, but I'd like to see this guy get the recognition that he deserves. I'm actually the chair of the History of Statistics Committee at the International Statistics Institute, and we're looking at revamping the Founder of Statistics series to not just include the European men, but to include a more wide variety of people that came up with interactive and innovative ways to complete statistics. So I only have 8 minutes, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. Ongoing issue. I would argue there are microaggressions in our data. So microaggressions are those little pinpricks that happen as you go through life. And examples can include, say, an African-American woman listening to 20 people in a day saying, "Oh, I love your hair, it's so ethnic," or, things that make us feel other, that make us feel separate. And we have these issues, these microaggressions in our data, especially as it comes to gender and sex. And so let's just start with official records. And I'm using the United States as a case study. And if you look at in most of the United States, we can be male, we can be female, but you don't have any other designation possible on most birth certificates. At least there hasn't been in the past. And this is inappropriate, not just in the current social context, but because the existence of intersex people has been documented as long as there have been people, right? And so for the entirety of our existence as human beings, there has been a possibility of people that don't neatly fall into male or female gender categories. And I use the example of a synthesis article published in the American Journal of Human Biology in 2000 that says that the percentage of individuals receiving corrective genital surgery was somewhere between 1 and 2 in 1,000, which if you add up to 300 million people is a lot of people. And the number of people that are some type of intersex could be as high as 2%. And that's some early research on that. So just on that argument, this shouldn't be the case. So what's going on in the current better understanding of this? Well, 25 states allow the designation of non-binary on licenses, which mean the other 25 don't. Only 24 states let you change your gender identity, and this is especially relevant to trans individuals, without any need for any proof, medical or legal proof. However, the majority of everybody else requires changing, requires you to have medical documentation or legal documentation to change your gender on your birth certificate. And Tennessee won't let you do it no matter what. It doesn't matter if they made a clerical error at the beginning. You cannot change your gender on your birth certificate. And so this was some data I collected in June. And then there's the question of just how other data collection processes other than official registries and official documentation occur. So this is some examples of some really bad data collection options that try to have something different than, just male and female. But, we have male, female, indeterminate. I think you know what your gender is, even if it's not male or female. Male, female, or human. Does that mean all the men and the women aren't human? male, female, NA, unknown, and tax entity. I mean, what is this, right? So why is this a microaggression? Um, well, having a birth certificate or driver's license with the wrong gender on it, you have to deal with that all the time. Every time you have to show a document to prove your identity, you see something that says you don't exist. Your identity does not exist as far as we're concerned. And this message is reinforced every time you have a survey form with two possible genders, or even, this is my big pet peeve lately, every statistics textbook I've ever seen uses some sort of male female binary for some kind of, to demonstrate some kind of statistical test. We need to be better about this. We need to be the ones that really think hard about how we're presenting gender in our data, in our survey forms, in our official records, and how that can really affect people and can cause, be those 1,000 paper clips that are continuously making people feel othered. So, having said all that, I hope I have 1 minute left. Am I doing okay, Sarah?
Yes, you
Okay,
have
great.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, great. All right, so summary. So I've taken you through three different pieces of history, through three different sets of issues related to how our history is affected by society and affects society. So my summary is that assumptions and biases are inherent in data, especially data about human beings. Remember our origins and stay vigilant about your own inherent biases. The second piece is that society awards the victors. Never forget that the history we see is the history that the victors wrote. And we need to be cognizant of that. Sometimes there's this argument that, well, that person was typical for the time. Well, do we really know that? In the case of Fisher, it turned out that wasn't true. And so we need to be really vigilant about fact checking, not just assuming that whatever the dominant narrative is what actually happened, is the ground truth, because it's not. There are more points of view. And then the third piece is bias and marginalization are inherent in our current lives. We contributed to it unwittingly. All of us have biases. It's how human beings' brains are programmed. Um, it's not enough to be fair about who and what you notice. You must also strive to determine who and what you are not noticing. What are my biases that are affecting people that I'm not even aware of? We all strive to be better human beings. We just all need to be able to accept that if this is part of being human, then we have to have a lifelong commitment to fighting those biases and trying to make a more equitable and just world. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. That was really cool. I learned a lot. Um, I think with
That's good.
that, yeah, let's all give Dr. Asher a round of applause, and then I'm going to stop the recording and we'll switch over to our next session.
Before you stop the recording, I just want
Yeah.
to say my email is janelynnasher@yahoo.com. You can look up my name. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this presentation or present materials or provide them with resources and materials.
Wonderful. Great note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you.